this meeting is being recorded, and I'd just like to say a very warm welcome to Hannah Wilson, who's joining us today for this conversation with Kyra Kelowan. We're delighted that ECIS and diverse educators are working to get very closely together and forming a partnership so that we can share resources and work together. And this afternoon, or this evening, or this morning, we have Hannah Wilson talking to us about the work they do. And this is the first of a sort of two-part in a beginning of a series. And Bennie, Kyra, her partner in this organisation, will be speaking to us possibly June. We're still working on dates, and will be the part two of this conversation. So I'm going to hand over to Kyra to do an introduction. And Hannah, thank you so very, very much for joining us today.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you to all of you who've managed to join us live, and we hope that for those of you watching back, a little recap of who's here would be great. So Hannah, we'll go through all of your illustrious working life and all of the different roles that you've had that have shaped you, but essentially you're a leadership development coach and trainer. I met you through the Women Ed Network, and of course today we're here to talk about the many different hats that you're wearing at the moment, but specifically about the book that has just been released, Diverse Educators, a Manifesto. So I'd like to hand over. I mean, I know we can see here on the side your former roles, and we'll go through sort of your journey, but really to ask you kind of how you started your life in DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, or in diversity and belonging, or whatever of the other multiple myriad terms come to mind. Can you walk us a bit back through your journey towards today?
It's an interesting question, so I get asked it quite a lot. At what point did my consciousness kick in? And I think it's an interesting one for us all to think about. And when I was 18, on my gap year, I was due to go and read English literature at my degree, and I decided to reapply and do post-colonial literature. So I think it was actually 18, 19 where I had that awareness that I didn't want to be reading all the dead white guys, which is pretty much what I consumed at GCSE and A-level English Lit. So spending 3 years immersed in literature from around the world and really grappling with some of the issues around studying text and translation. When I then became an English teacher, I had that lens. So I think that was my kind of my DEI teacher journey started back in, I don't know, it was like 1998, 1999. And then spending 19 years teaching English and drama in very, very diverse inner city schools in South London, I just constantly questioned why I wasn't seeing the leadership teams, the governance and the teachers reflecting the children in the schools. Like I was working in schools where like 60-65% of the kids were from diverse backgrounds, but I just didn't see that. So I did a TED talk back in 2015, 16, questioning that. And really asking, like, do we feel comfortable that we are serving diverse communities, but our staffing structures doesn't actually reflect that? Around that time, as a deputy head, I was the only female on an SLT. And that's why I was part of the co-founders of Women Ed, that we were having a question about, in a female-heavy profession, why don't we see more female leaders? Why don't we see more female head teachers in particular? And now I'd say executive heads and CEOs, because actually we're just moving the kind of the glass ceilings up. So that was kind of 7 years ago that Women Ed started. And I'm really proud to see the legacy of what Women Ed's doing now and seeing all the amazing international work. I feel back when I became a head teacher, but within a few months of putting back, Bennie and I had a conversation about intersectionality and how she had to choose and cut herself into four to go to 4 events to speak to the 4 bits of who she is. And that's where the concept of diverse ed came from, that we needed a coherent, cohesive conversation to talk about our whole selves rather than today I'm gay and tomorrow I'm brown and the week after I'm this, that and the other. And I do think we perpetuate that labelling and that ticking boxes quite a lot in education, and that's why diverse ed came about, as a way to join up the dots and to have one conversation about all identities rather than almost like picking which network I'm going to connect with today.
Yeah, and that leads us really nicely to the book and to the publication then. And how did that sort of come about? When did that journey start? And can you tell us, if we haven't read it already, what we can expect, kind of what is in the manifesto?
I'm excited that Jessica's here. She's one of our contributors. We've actually got one of our authors in the room. So the idea around the book was that at our events and through the website, we use the Equality Act of 2010 to structure it so that we've got the 9 protected characteristics, and that kind of like curates, I guess, what we talk about, what we write about, what we share from a resource point of view. And Bennie and I spent a long time mapping out the book and how we wanted there to be balance. We could have filled the sex chapter and the race chapter 4 or 5 times over. We were inundated in offers from women and people of colour, because this was 2 years ago. We were in the wake of George Floyd's murder. They were perhaps the 2 spotlighted protected characteristics at that time. But we really wanted there to be that balance, and we also wanted it to be from the voice of people with lived experience and the identity in each chapter. So we firstly put out a call to submit. And I think we had 350 people who wanted to be in a book for 110 slots. So that was hard in itself, actually going through the process of thinking about the balance of diversity within diversity. But in the sexual orientation chapter, we didn't want it to be 10 white gay men talking about sexual orientation, or in the race chapter, it was 10 black women. I can see some smiles here, but like thinking about how we were looking at the diversity within each chapter was quite a complex balancing act. And thinking about the balance throughout the whole book then, and looking at representation of primary and secondary and independent and international and state schools. And we had some young people contributing as well. So that was a really important balancing act. So we basically ended up with our 110 people, and 1 person in each team stepped up to be the chapter editor. And the chapter editor, so Jess, you were in the Managers and Partnership team, weren't you, Jackie Hill? So Jackie Hill was the chapter editor for that team. And she had 10 people contributing. I think actually there was some co-authors, maybe it was 11 or 12, and they operated as a team, and they mapped out in our chapter what are the key issues we want to unpack and explore. So it really was a kind of a team effort, reframing the context, and then they went off and drafted, came back and had an ongoing conversation about, is this actually representing us individually and collectively, and how does this actually then speak to other chapters in the book? So like 2 of the chapters that had to really speak to each other was the chapter around sex and the chapter around gender identity. And those 2 chapter editors worked really closely together to think about the overlap between those 2 parts of the book. So it was a mammoth task. I don't think we perhaps appreciated when we did the proposal and took everyone on board. My emails have been crazy for the last 2 years. It's been a lot of communication, but for me, like harnessing that collective voice was really, really important. This book is by the network, for the network. It's 125 voices. And that's powerful in itself, I think, the kind of the solidarity of everyone seeing themselves as a sum of parts.
Yeah, and that's what I love about watching how you work, Hannah. It's always collaborative. It's always involving, many multiple different types of voice and many different layers of leadership as well, from lifting others up who are at the start of their leadership journeys to those who are already alongside you. Who do you see as the educational leaders? And perhaps there are some here in the room, I'm sure, but who are the educational leaders that you see embodying the work every day? Who do you think that, if we're new to this conversation, if we're a sort of head of school who's just made a pledge maybe at the ECIS conference to get more involved and to try and replicate and embody this work, who should they be following? Who do they need to be reading now?
Really good question, because one of the things we always provoke anyone in our training sessions to think about is how diverse is your network? When you look at who you follow on Twitter, who you're connected with on LinkedIn, who you're reading, are you reading and following people who look like you and have a similar experience to you? Or are you consciously disrupting your own bubble to actually learn from others? So I find it quite interesting when I scroll through some of the educational press Twitter handles. It's like white man, white man, white man, white man. You might get 20 tweets down. There's someone with a different identity who's been asked to actually comment on DEI. So one of the things we do as an ongoing piece of work is that we've got a massive gallery on our website. So every time someone blogs or someone speaks at an event, or all the people who contributed to our books, we put their mugshot on there. They don't always like it, but here they are, here's their face, here's their Twitter handle, here's their LinkedIn profile. So we are elevating and amplifying the individuals within the network with the idea that there's no excuse if you are curating an event to not go and find some diverse speakers. We've got 450 on our website. Just spend 10 minutes looking at our website and reach out. So I think that's really important. The other thing we do is we curate a DEI reading list, which is, I've added 4 new books to it just this week. that we've had a flurry of books being published by the network in the last few months. So, for example, Virginia Mendez, who's in our book, has just published a book around gender expression in early years of childhood. Lindsay and Lucy, who are in our book, have just published a book around flexible working. Emma Shepherd, who's not in our book, her book's about to come out around pregnancy and maternity in family-friendly schools. And Aisha Thomas, who's done lots of work with us but wasn't in the book, has just published a book around anti-racist education. So just capturing those kind of books and signposting them, I think it's really important. And we also create lists on our Twitter handle, so you can then follow the list. So say, for example, the event that Emily was at, and when she did the World Education Summit with us, here are our 7 speakers, here are the 7 Twitter handles. So you're constantly sort of like growing and amplifying, but diversifying those circles you sit in. I think that's a really important part of the work, personally.
Yeah, and one of the things that you told me maybe a year and a half ago that stuck with me since, that I keep repeating in conversations about leadership and how we can model excellent leadership in DEI, was that you just said, share your platform, you know, share your voice, share your stage whenever you're invited to speak to something. If you are one of the people who usually has the slot, who usually has the power, think about who you can share that moment with. And that stuck with me, and I think it's really something that we can all bring forward into our work.
Can I add to that? Like, we invited Emily to be the keynote at our conference in June, and her instant response was, please, can you, like, is there racial representation? And we always make sure that happens, but if that's her standard response to any event that asks them to speak, that's really important, because I used to say no to events that weren't diverse, but then they'd ask another straight white woman to speak who would say yes without checking the lineup. And I think that's really important. There's so many events that go wrong because everyone says yes in isolation, and then you suddenly see yourself on a flyer or on a schedule with 20 other straight white people, and that's really problematic. So I do think that intentionality, even if Emily will probably know that I would be making sure it's part of the conference, that's her standard response to hold us to account. I think that's great modelling.
Yeah, I agree. And hopefully we can hear from those assembled in the room here at the end and get a bit of a conversation flowing. I just have a couple more questions to ask you about, and it follows on from resources. So which other resources? You've mentioned the fantastic list that you're creating. We've also been working to create educator resources for primary, secondary, and for educators themselves who want to read. Where else should people go if they need an easy go-to, if they need to start to inform and involve themselves to become part of the change? You know, where do you go? I know Twitter is probably your main source, but let's say that you don't want to be on Twitter, or let's say that you're not yet. Where else? Where can people go? I
think LinkedIn's better than Twitter, personally, Kyra. I think I've consciously networked with people doing DEI out of our sector on LinkedIn. It's much easier to network on LinkedIn. I don't think there's a day goes by where I don't see a brilliant article on LinkedIn that I then share on my Twitter feed. So I'm kind of like doing that constant kind of scoping. I'm lucky, I guess, because I've built a big network. Most stuff gets sent to me. So I'm like slightly lazy, but basically people just DM me and say, can you share this blog? Can you share this article? We've written a book. But for me, it's the curation of it. The overwhelm of this work can really kick in where you don't know where to start, and there's so much information to kind of filter. And that's when we built the website. So just to signpost some of the things on the website to help people save time and energy, the DEI directory has 190 organisations in it, A to Z, or you can search by protected characteristics. So if you're looking for support with race in your school, there are 20 organisations on our radar doing that work. So rather than spending an hour trying to find them, here they all are, have a look at them, pick who resonates with you. Alongside that, I mentioned the reading list. We've also got the glossaries. So as a former English teacher, I think the literacy of this work is really, really important. I think the language, particularly the acronyms, can become a massive barrier to actually people being part of the conversation. So we've got a growing glossary of key terms, which we use for our programme, but we encourage everyone on our programme to download it, create a local copy, and to add new words to it, and to agree in your local context which words we're comfortable using. And as soon as I published it, I got lots of thanks, and I said, and then I was asked to do an acronym one, and that was really interesting. Like the growing list of acronyms that kind of like it is what we use to refer to different people. So we've got that acronym list there as well. Alongside the directory and the kind of those tools, we've got the toolkits. So we commission people with lived experience to curate the listening, reading and watching, where if you want to know more about trans inclusion or menopause awareness or flexible working, it's all on one page. Again, for self-directed learning, but you don't have to spend hours finding it all. It's already there for you. And I think one of the most popular bits of our website is actually the blog. So we've published 450 people in the last 2 years. Anyone can submit a blog about DEI, any aspect of DEI. I think I've got about 20 to go out over the next 3 or 4 weeks. And Sarah was just saying, like, today's blog is by Jenin, who is in the UAE, who has written a piece around, as an Arab, how she experiences racism within different racial contexts, and the tension between some of the different racial identities in her context. So just an invitation to anyone listening, if you're interested in getting your voice and your thoughts out there, drop me a DM, send me a blog, we'd love to publish you.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, there is so much out there, and I think that's part of why I wanted to make sure that our community, our ECIS community internationally, had access to all of the great things that were already on your website in those really, excellent baskets of quick access information around a particular protected characteristic or a particular theme. So if people are starting to identify, okay, we know we have a blind spot in this area and we really, really want to look at race, or we really want to look at disability, we just love the way your site was organized. And I think it's something that we're going to try and imitate in some ways, because it's just so simple. And you're right, there is no excuse really when you think about all of the different sources of information now, to not just go a bit deeper diving into what exists.
A word you just used there, Kyla, because we used to talk about blind spots quite a lot, and we consciously try not to use that language now because it is ableist. And I think that's a great example of 2 years ago on our programme. We asked people to think about their individual and collective blind spots.
Sure, they're biased.
Later, we're challenging ourselves and each other. Actually, we're being casually ableist there by using that term. And I think that's just a really good example of how we iterate the language and how we have to model the changes in language, but how we also hold others to account. Hopefully that was a constructive way. That
it was. You're absolutely right.
And we don't always necessarily mean what we say.
Absolutely. And I mean, thank you, because that's part of why the conversation often is just skimmed over in many places. Because as you were talking about acronyms, I was thinking about how many leaders I know who are frightened, who don't know what the right acronym is, who don't know how to use it. And so it's just avoided. It's just kind of wallpapered over. And of course, in the flow of natural conversation, all of us say things that don't necessarily tally with our beliefs. But I really want to thank you for sort of making a point out of that, because it's really easily done. And of course, it's just about remaining open, isn't it?
Emily's put another one in the chat. Yeah, brilliantly, because colourblind gets used so much. We talk in HR speak.
Oh yeah.
We're proud we're doing a gender blind process. Well, is that really something to be proud of? Like, the language is so important, and I don't think we're always self-reflective enough about the nuance of how we can tweak the language to be more inclusive.
Learning from you still as an English teacher. Thank you. No, it's really important, a really important point. Okay, so let's move on from that into one of the questions I had, which I was really looking forward to hearing what you would say, is what, in your opinion, is the biggest elephant in the room that we have? And let's think about this both in an international context, because I think that's a really important conversation for our particular community. But what's the most pressing change needed, in your opinion, to start making real change in our context as we have it right now?
Isn't it? I mean, for me, I think it's probably twofold. I think we really need to get into difficult conversations about power privilege and who has the power privilege in our organisations. And everyone in the room will be very aware that it's usually white, it's usually heterosexual, it's between all those dominant groups. But we've got people who shy away from conversations because they worry that their power will be taken away, or they'll lose power by inviting others into the space. And I think that is something we really need to navigate. And I do a lot of work with international schools where the person who's been sent on the programme has been sponsored on the programme, but is then hitting their head against the wall with some of the things that they need to do as part of the programme, because you've been given permission to do the programme, but like know where your box is, like stay within your lane, like don't start challenging the SLT or the board around these things. So for me, it's that you can't do this work in a performative way, and there's a lot of people doing it in a performative way where it's very external and it's very superficial and it's very like shiny and showy, and that is problematic, because just like there's quite a lot of critiques there about using like generic photos and prospectuses on websites to make your school look more diverse than it actually is. That's insincere and it's inauthentic, and that is something that's really problematic to call out, because the people doing it think they're being inclusive, but actually they're perpetuating some of the problems, and it's tokenistic, absolutely. So I think that's an interesting thing to navigate. And one of the things I'm being coached on is that most of my coaching clients, most of my people I'm doing my programs with me, or any of my clients are usually female heads and female CEOs. And I personally, my personal challenge is I need to work with more straight white male heads or CEOs, but they don't necessarily gravitate towards me, and I don't necessarily gravitate towards them, because my network's very, very different. And I think that's something that I'm consciously trying to lean into, those conversations, because I know how to do this work supporting female leaders or leaders from diverse backgrounds, but actually we've got dominant leadership style, and how do we penetrate those kind of spaces and disrupt those kind of spaces is my ongoing kind of like.
I was going to ask, yeah, do you have any suggestions? Maybe we'll get to that in the comments and in the chat afterwards, because I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. You're right, you know, we all gravitate towards similar at first anyway, and there's a real difficulty for some of us in order to step outside of the lines of who we usually hang out with and the water cooler conversations we are used to having. So I'd be really interested in thoughts from those assembled here today on that when we get to the comments. So last but not least, what's one simple but crucial action that anyone who has showed up today, either presentially now or who is watching this back after the fact and listening to it, can take today to ensure that they are agents for positive change in their own right, in their own settings, wherever they're at in the journey?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we get asked quite a lot, like, what do we do first? And I think we have to meet people where they are, because everyone's on different journeys and organizations on different places. But for me, we talk about things like they are a given, like psychological safety, courageous conversations. And my question would be, like, where's the actual belonging? Where's the actual intentional design for inclusion? Where's the training for inclusion? So everyone's banging on about, we need to have courageous conversations in our school. Have you actually trained your staff on how to have courageous conversations? Have you got a coaching culture? Are you equipping them and upskilling them to be able to call each other out? So I think people know that we need a cultural shift, but actually, are we investing in the skills change, the behavioural change we actually need to underpin that cultural sort of like iteration, I guess. So I've been asked 3 or 4 times in the last 2 weeks to run a training on courageous conversations, because people don't know where to start. And I think if we all went into training like that and we all developed our own skills, then the conversations do become a lot more comfortable, because we've contracted and we've agreed that, if I say something wrong, you challenge back. And
my dog will challenge me too.
It's an agreed interaction, but you can't do a courageous conversation by yourself, because I read a book or listened to a podcast. So for me, there's something there about the actual CPD offer. I think sometimes we dive into the conceptual stuff before thinking about the behavioural stuff.
I was waiting to unmute because there's a riot going on behind me, so I'm sorry about that. My apologies. I have a little dachshund and they're very argumentative. I totally agree, and I think, you know, what I'd love to do is open up the floor now for conversation, because this is designed to be a conversation live, and you know, I wanted to hear from experts that we have here in the room about some of those things, some of those simple but crucial actions that you think or that you have seen taking place in the communities that are doing this work with success. And also to reach out to you for ideas about, you know, how to confront the elephants in the room, how to start those difficult conversations, and any other thoughts that you have, and especially those of you who've already worked with Hannah in any respect or in any other ways. It would be really interesting to hear, for example, from Jessica. I saw her nodding a lot, and I saw a lot of support for what you were saying, Hannah. So if anyone wants to just chime in with any other questions or any other comments, now would be a really great time.
I'm happy to jump in. Hi, Hannah.
Hey, Jess.
You still in the
Cape 30? I am.
Yes, that's it. Amazing. Wow. Weather's not too bad here, but I think it's a lot better where you are. So yeah, just to say, I've been teaching for 26 years, and I'm head of art and DT, and I've also worked in senior teams in some schools that I've worked in as well. And one of the things I'd say is work out where you start from. Some schools are really far on a journey, some schools aren't. And obviously be very sensitive to sort of how you begin the conversation, but also be brave. One of the things I did, I just started in a new role a couple of years ago, and quite a diverse team that I'm working with, but they weren't teaching using very diverse makers, because obviously in art and design we look at other people for inspiration, and a lot of the people they were looking at were dead white Europeans. And when I raised that, they just hadn't even thought about it at all, despite the fact that they came from many different backgrounds. So that was the first conversation we had. How do we improve the sort of diversity in the people we look to for inspiration? And then we started the conversation from there. And then my school's actually gone on a journey of decolonializing I can never say that word properly, the curriculum, which we're obviously still on. And one of the issues I've got is that we're looking at a very kind of African orientated focus on the people we're looking at, but the majority of the kids in our school are Asian. So my question is, why are we looking at more role models from their community? I mean, obviously it should be diverse. It shouldn't be, oh, because most of the kids are Muslim, we're just going to look at Muslim role models. But it's interesting that there aren't actually a lot of those, despite the fact that that's the majority of our population, and about 50% of the staff are as well. So yeah, it's kind of, and when I raised that, they were like, oh yeah. And a lot of, I think a lot of the stuff at the moment is very focused around Black work because of the Black Lives Matter movement and everything. But I think you've got to look at the bigger diversity, which I think the book that I contributed to certainly is a great starting point. So if you're not sure where to start your conversation, read that book, or read the chapters in that book that resonate the most with you. I actually was one of the people who originally put forward to go for the sex or gender chapters, and obviously they were majorly oversubscribed, so Hannah asked me if I'd write for the marriage one instead. And I ended up writing a section on something that I hadn't really thought about. Like, it wasn't sort of like core to what I was really passionate about at that time, but it was really interesting to read more around the prefix that we add to ourselves when we are gendered as male or female in a relationship. And men are just Mr. and women can be all sorts of different things. So that was a really interesting starting point. So yeah, read the book, just look at the titles, the bits that resonate with you, read those bits, because what's great about each chapter is that they give you questions to start thinking about further, and then actions that you could start taking to change things in your context. And all of us can, I think I read a really good quote on Twitter just today, actually, from two different people quoted the same thing. The small, it's small actions every day that make change, not one big action. So, do what you can when you can, but keep doing it.
Thanks, Jessica. Some great points I want to pick up on there. Where are you exactly? I might ask.
I'm currently in my bed, not my bed, in my workroom at home in London. I just had a knee operation, so I'm actually off work for 2 weeks recuperating, but I would normally be in work right now. Okay. Yeah, teaching Tower Hamlets, and I live in Lewisham.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, so many great points that you make about, reading, of course, in the areas that are first interesting to you or that first capture you, but then, making sure that you're thinking about the lenses that your students need. And I think student-centered is something that, we all need to be thinking about more, because often, it's our students who actually have, they have the knowledge, or they at least have the references that they know that they want to see, and we are actively stopping that from happening, or not opening the spaces enough. So I thought it was really interesting when you said over half of your population are from Asian British backgrounds, and so yeah, of course they're going to need mentors, of course they're going to need to see themselves, and for those staff as well, it's surely just as simple as, what are you reading right now, who's important to you, whose work matters, and just integrating that. So that we see ourselves in the curriculum, we see ourselves on the walls, we see ourselves. Sarah's got her hand up. I'm going to ask her to lean in here, and I can see lots of great messages in the chat. I'm just inviting anyone who's written something to come on in.
You're on mute, darling.
I just have a question about the point that you've been talking to of reading up, being brave about being on the journey, knowing that we're going to be making mistakes, knowing that the networking is important. And yet for quite a lot of educators, I think, who would like to be exploring the journey further, are in schools where if I dare to say, you know, there are schools that feel quite smug, international schools in particular, who feel quite smug about the fact that, well, we're a diverse population, and so we're all very happy, and that's one of the things that we do best. We've been doing this forever, and you know, have failed perhaps to recognise that what we're asking our families, our colleagues to do is to assimilate, not to integrate, whether that's to do with their national, cultural demographics, or whether that's to do with gender, or whether that's to do with all of the things that we've been talking about, and find themselves in situations where they feel quite isolated and quite lonely. And raising their voices is not an easy thing to do. What's your advice in those situations, Hannah, in terms of moving from reading, resourcing, finding out, and being able to move into meaningful action? Either you leave the school, of course.
Yeah, that's great, and it speaks to some of the stuff that Heather's put, which I'll speak to in a second. Like, for me, we can't conflate diversity with inclusion, and people equate one to the other. Just because we've got a diverse student body or a diverse staff body does not mean that we are an inclusive school. And like, one of the provocations that Angie and I ask on our programme whenever we're doing training for heads or governors is, every school in the country, I'm talking about the UK here, thinks they're inclusive. Every head thinks they're inclusive. Every teacher thinks they're inclusive. If we were truly inclusive, would we be in the mess we're in right now in society? And I think that's a really good starting point, that actually inclusion needs to be inclusion by intent and inclusion by design. And the obsession that we see in the last 2 years of diversifying the curriculum, the library, the workforce, the governing body, the SLT, that is not enough. Like, it's about how are you actually changing the culture of your school? How are you actually intentionally creating a more inclusive workplace, more inclusive policies and practices? And that takes a lot more work than putting some different people into the curriculum. And so I think that's one of the problems. I think sometimes we're perhaps putting our time and attention into the wrong part of the DEI kind of triangle. Get the inclusion right, and you will diversify your workforce, because you'll be in a more inclusive school and you'll have a more inclusive curriculum. So that's my first point. My second point is, I guess it's thinking about it, and it goes to Heather's point here, which I hear a lot, Heather, in both state schools, private schools, and international schools, that it's who has voice and agency within the school building. And we've all heard problematic situations whereby George Floyd got murdered, a white SLT spent their summer writing their anti-racist policy and their anti-racist training. September the 1st, they delivered the training. They're all white. They have not consulted a single person of colour. They've not actually listened to the staff in their school who are people of colour, but they think that their intent is good, but the impact is catastrophic. And I think that is something we really need to call in and have conversations about. That I am very mindful, as a heterosexual, cisgender, white, able-bodied woman, that I'm not always the best person to be doing the talking. I lean out and I find the right people to step in. And I think that's something that we really need to continue to challenge and disrupt. But when you've got a white member of SLT saying we're going to launch some affinity groups, that power dynamic is really, really problematic. So I think we need to think about how we can democratize actually the kind of the hierarchy of the schools in which we work. And that makes people feel quite uncomfortable even thinking about that, because I've worked in some very hierarchical schools. So I haven't got necessarily a solution to that. We need to chip away at it. But for me, staff voice and student voice activities are really, really important. And thinking about how we leverage that and how we actually get people to stop and pause and listen to the truth, the lived experience within the building, and not operate on a hunch or an anecdote.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Heather to step in, because she's been frantically in the chat making some amazing comments. I'm just hoping you can share some of them with us live, so that those of us who weren't here live could benefit from your viewpoints, Heather.
I've actually been in 7 international schools, so I've seen a variety of different locations and places and different local settings and such. I was really happy that DEI started becoming a more broadly discussed topic after 2020, because I actually had a unique experience as, I hate taking this credit, but it is a unique experience. I was very much part of a program on my University of Illinois campus where I met some people as a Latin American studies student who were trying to fight for a Latino studies program. And they just last week celebrated 30 years of this protest that they'd had against the university administration, who refused to allow a Mexican student association at their university. And all of the work that has happened since. When I was visiting with them in 2008, I was invited to be a part of their board that they were creating for they called themselves the Latina Alumni Association Board, knowing full well I was not actually Latina, but because I had worked with them and I was helping them. And for 3 years I served on this board. I was in a unique position to support. And also when I was in University of Illinois, I was part of the Black chorus and sang at the National Gospel Choir Workshop. and it was a unique experience. So these uncomfortable situations were things that I was able to put myself in at a very young age. So when I went to university and got my master's degree, and it was at it was a master's in teaching program. And the reason I got it was because they had all these pictures of diversity all over their website. And I was like, that's where I need to go. And when I got there, it was funny because there was 10 Black people on campus out of 200. And out of that, only 5 of them were actually African-American. And they had come because they had wanted to be part of the program, but many of them felt like they were being asked to be the representation of their people, to explain to teachers, white teachers, what it was like to be a Black person. And I actually met someone, and I was shocked, who was 30 years old, who had never met a Black person in their life. And I grew up in a neighborhood where I was part of their family. So it was very, very strange for me. So I find that most of my teaching career has been, that's why I've been so excited. I was using teaching tolerance long before it became learning for justice. One of my students was actually part of Facing History and Ourselves. I don't know if you guys know that research. And so I constantly have tried to integrate this information into my curriculum and bring that to the schools. But it is very difficult that these schools that I have had experience in do not know how to interact and treat people, even if they're British Jamaican, for instance. It's a school that's run mostly by British people. We have British Jamaican people on campus, and they are not treated with the respect that they deserve as a teacher. So I was watching all of these teacher of color Facebook pages, and I support every single one of them. AIELOC. I've gotten to know Eldane Winter, and I've learned from Dominique Delay's webinars. So it's so simple, you'd think, to do this. And then I look and I see all these DEIs, and every single one of them has a white face on it. Like, I went to a NEASC one, and I was shocked that the NEASC one was still talking about stuff that when I was in Vermont in 2004 and 2005, we were discussing on campus at that time and trying to get TESOL and other organizations to be involved and do this work, but it was seemingly new. So I'm older now. I'm still learning about the other aspects. Since I've been in the Middle East, LGBTQ plus, etc. That is a very difficult conversation to have in some Muslim countries. I was really happy when I was in China because it was easier to have a conversation about that. But having these, it's such a wide variety of DEIJ that, and you would just hope, you would have hoped that international schools would have have embraced all of this and asked people to give training. How can we have these conversations? How can we listen? I think the biggest thing that I've learned from the ECIS leadership conferences, leadership workshops, has been the active listening. Like, we have got to put that at the forefront of all training, active listening.
Thank you. Yeah.
With people and teachers and kids. Sorry.
Thank you for saying.
So
no. I was trying to show you that. I was trying to show you that I was actively listening to you, and instead I interrupted you. But I wanted to thank you for saying that, because I think it's so crucial. We have to start with listening to our communities, and that's essentially what your points in the chat were saying. You know, some people are frightened they're at an impasse, or they feel that they can't begin because they haven't actually listened to the needs of their community, or they're trying to do good work and they're trying to do it from a place of, you know, maybe feeling better about themselves, being culturally appropriate, as you put it. But I wanted
to. And they have to create the space to provide that ability. They have to learn how to sit down and make that space so that people are comfortable to speak. I think that's one of the things that would have to be the first thing to learn.
Absolutely.
Sorry, that's the last thing I'm going to
No,
say.
thank you so much, Heather. And I wanted to pull in Emily, if she's happy to comment on that. As someone who has a lot of experience in the international school community, I just wondered if there's anything that you have to add there, listening to those points about listening to your communities, also recognizing whose voices you have and which ones you haven't heard.
I would be happy to, but you probably didn't notice Michael's got a hand up, so maybe I can go after Michael.
I didn't notice. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, I'm sure you did. I'm happy to go after Michael.
Sure, go for it, Michael.
Oh, thanks, Emily. But you anyway. No, I have a little question or advice from all of you who are so into diversity. So no, I'm an elementary assistant principal, and one thing I'm struggling with this year is like, how do we teach elementary students about like bias, discrimination, but like not making them feel othered or marginalized? So basically, like, one story, this year I ran every month we have a diversity, equity, inclusion theme, and it was in February, we did it on BIPOC, and every month we asked for volunteers. There was no one, so I championed it, which I was excited about. And, you know, as a white person trying to talk about this issue and championing it, what I did was I brought in, I reached out to BIPOC members of our community, like different teachers and middle high school students, and they did as a little entry point, they did a little sharing about some of the experiences they faced with race and racism, and thought, you know, during it was amazing. It was, you know, out of the world. But one thing that really upset me, and it still doesn't sit well with me, is there's a kindergarten student, and when they went home, they spoke to their parents, and they were like, oh my gosh, when I get older, like, everyone's going to treat me in a really bad way because I'm Black, right? And it was like, oh, like, I'm trying so hard to do this work, and then and I'm like, that is terrible. Like, I feel so awful about this, and I keep on thinking, like, how do we? And I think it's caused a good discussion at our school about it, but it's like, how are we supposed to bring in these issues? And I don't just want to do the classic, like, you know, not classic, but like Black history. Let's just show, you know, Black people. You know, I want to tackle the underlying issues with, you know, discrimination, all these things. But by doing that, I also, with elementary age, don't want to make kids go home and feel like the world's going to be racist towards them. So that's one thing that I'm struggling this year. And it really didn't, and the parents, when they spoke to me, they came out of a really nice place. They're like, we just want to let you know, like, our child feels like they're going to enter into a really racist world. And like, we don't really agree with how your school did it. So there was a lot of successes from it too. Like, but that one negative really just did not sit well with me, especially as like a white person trying to bring in this issue and having, yeah, I don't know if you have any advice. That's just how that's something that hasn't sit well with me.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I'll just come share my thoughts on that, because it is really tricky, where it's that intent over impact thing, isn't it? That what we intend to do and how it's received, sometimes there is that dissonance. And one of the things that comes up a lot in the UK is this phrase age appropriate, and what's the age appropriate phase or year group to have different conversations. And some of the pushback around LGBTQI inclusion in the younger years, that early years reception, to our sort of 3 to 6 year olds, it's not age appropriate to be talking about racism or homophobia in that phase. But my comeback is, but if they're old enough to experience it, it's old enough to talk about it, but it's how we talk about it. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? About how we start the conversations young and we spiral them and we build them up and we introduce the ideas. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Andy Moffat's work, but he's the one I definitely recommend following for the younger years, that he does amazing work around inclusion in the early years settings, and he teaches the Equalities Act through picture books, where you start the concepts and the ideas young, but you do it through animals, you do it through pictures, you do it through stories. So we're sowing those seeds. That's just what I was just hearing. Just to give you permission not to criticise yourself for getting that one complaint, because ultimately that's 99% of the audience, and it landed how you wanted it to land. And this work can feel so critical and such a deficit model a lot of the time, that we're constantly being told we're doing wrong, and we're constantly telling ourselves that we're self-scrutinising for all the things we want to be doing. But if we can flip that and affirm what we are doing, which is more than we were doing yesterday, and thinking about how we move forward, it's getting that balance, isn't it? And one of my mantras to myself is to embrace this work with curiosity rather than criticality, because it can become a very critical space and very sort of like us criticising each other and ourselves for everything we're not doing right. So I just wanted to acknowledge, like, well done for doing the work, and you'll take that feedback on and you'll iterate it and you'll think about how to do it slightly differently next time, so it lands a little bit differently as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Pleasure.
It's true, no, because overall it was such a success this year, but it's like, it's just that one kid, like,
That one thing.
it's
That
that
one
one
thing
that really hits you, you know?
We've all had that, Michael. And I'm sorry for not seeing your hand up as well. I was not ignoring you.
Should we bring Emily in?
Let's come back to Emily. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say I admire, Michael, your vulnerability there, because this work can be scary because of the mistakes we might make. And it's really hard to make those mistakes in front of people. And it can feel like, oh no, now I need to stop. But I'm really glad that you're sort of using that as a growth opportunity and seeking feedback. So I congratulate you on that. And Heather made a good point in the chat about having these conversations with families as well. And I was going to say, because of the work I do is really around gender and sexual identity, but you can think about this as well when it comes to other marginalized groups. There's this kind of idea that people in dominant groups have like a neutral identity, and that when we have these conversations, we're just talking about folks in marginalized positions. But with younger kids, instead of diving right into like racism, you could just start with identity development, because we all have identities. And so like white racial identity development and cisgender identity development and all of that. So kids are exploring just what is identity, what is my identity, and even dominant group identities, they're not neutral, they're still a position. And so that can be a really, maybe a less threatening starting point, but still super impactful and, you know, supportive in the work that I can see you're really wanting to commit to. And then to follow up on the question that you were asking about, I think I was listening to Michael and now I've forgotten the question. I think you were asking about listening and listening to the voices in your community. So I have, yes, 100% you want to listen to the voices in your community, but we sort of don't have to wait for that necessarily. So sometimes if there is not a trusted relationship there, the marginalized folks in your community might just say, we're good, like I don't owe you my trauma story. So we don't necessarily have to wait for that. There's so many people who have written about equity and belonging work who you can pay for their expertise, either as consultants or as authors or whatever their products are. You don't need to use the emotional labor of the folks in your community if they simply don't trust you or don't want to do that work right now. You can still get started and do your own work by reading and consuming the materials that these experts in the field have produced. And also I will say, because I work with queer communities, in particular queer youth, a lot of times it isn't necessarily safe for young queer kids to like speak up and share their stories, especially working in international contexts. So I lean a lot on research, academic peer-reviewed research, to tell me here is what we already know. You don't necessarily need to, I call it like the prove it again. You don't necessarily need to wait for the queer kids in your community to say, like, I'm hurting, I am being harmed, and in order to
go ahead, keep going.
yes, in order to get started on doing this work, we can look at what has already been shown in the research and get started straight away. So
yeah, and just to add to that, Emily, your point back to Michael about his willingness to be vulnerable in this very safe space. I see that time and time again where the SLT are asking, senior leaders, are asking the teachers who have got marginalised identities to be vulnerable and to share, but are they prepared to share? And I think that's something we really need to tackle, that actually vulnerability and authenticity, we can all embrace that, but I don't think we should be asking anybody to do something we're not prepared to do ourselves. Yeah, absolutely. And it's that we're potentially re-traumatizing the situation and perpetuating the power dynamic. And going back to your point, Heather, about who feels safe to actually be honest, one of the things we get people to think about is, like, when you ask people to share their lived experience, how is that data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, going to be used? And how are you reassuring people how that data is going to inform strategy? Because so many people have been asked historically to share it and nothing's changed. So why do they actually want to reshare it and actually feel even more vulnerable within their organisation as well?
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily, for those really salient points, because you know, I think what I wanted you to sort of draw out was that, yeah, you might want to listen to the community, but the community are not always willing to say things. But you've got to check that is a safe space first. And so I think, you know, highlighting the work of others, bringing in voices that would never usually be listened to in those communities, and doing the work to identify which ones they are would be a really great place to start. So yeah, I'm gonna definitely finish or bring us to a close with kind of a slide that I wanted to just have up so that everybody knows where to find out more from Hannah, and of course how to follow the work that we're doing. And of course our work at ECIS is all about bringing in other voices that we are not usually interacting with, or that we have our own learning to do from many of the really respected authors and conferences in the space. And so if anything is missing from our own section of the website, you can see what we're doing at ecis.org/DIJ. But of course, the work that Hannah and your collective are doing on diverseeducators.co.uk is where we wanted to point everybody towards. So if you want to stay in touch with Hannah, you might probably follow her. Oh, you can't see it. Sorry, thank you. I saw your face looking confused. Hang on.
Yeah, the second and third slide have been shared.
Let's go back in. You should be able to see it now. Does it work?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Okay. Just to give people an insight into what we're doing and how they can stay in touch with you, Hannah, although I'm sure that most of you who are here today already follow Hannah. And thank you all for giving us your time live during your lunch hour, wherever it is that you are in the world. And we appreciate it. And of course, we will be running part 2 of this conversation with Bennie. We will continue to go into some of the deeper learning about the curriculum the Diverse Educators book has been working to implement in its various places. And in other subsequent conversations, we'd love to have your ideas about who we need to feature, who we need to have on board, and who we need to listen to and learn from. Thank you to Hannah, who's posted a 25% discount for the book on the website, which is a really good point. And thank you again for being here with us. We really appreciate your time, your voices, your insights, and you calling us out when we need help in the text and the information that we're sharing. Thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Once again, thanks, Hannah, for joining us from Cabo Verde. Enjoy the sun out there.
Stay in touch.
Stay in touch, everyone.
I'm going to just say thank you as well. And as we said at the beginning, it is a recorded session. And so we're intending to put that onto our media archive.
It will be on our Twitter and on our website.
If everybody's happy with that. Thank you so much for your participation.